Hello everybody. Welcome, my name's Scott Maier. This is Drawing Together with Artists Network, and it's Wednesday, 3 p.m. Eastern. So what we're working on today, this drawing of this snowy scene, because it's winter, not here in Colorado, where it's like 60 degrees and sunny and craziness. So to get us into the mood for winter, I chose this scene here. So I want to welcome everybody. Thank you for joining me today. I love seeing where everybody's viewing from. It's awesome to see all the familiar names. Yeah, so let's get to it. We'll keep talking as we're going. If you're new, what you're looking at is Drawing Together. So people from around the world, we all get together to draw together every Wednesday because we need to take some time out of our busy lives to draw. Each week there's a new subject. We try to challenge ourselves in particular ways so that we can continue to grow as artists. This here is done in graphite. If you want to see the materials, that's in the description below, along with the link to the reference image. So feel free to draw along, sit back and watch, draw later. If you want to use a different material to draw this, go ahead, it's all good. So what we're here to do is share our ideas, thoughts, comments, questions with the group here so that we can get going. So feel free to shout out any questions. If you type them out in all caps, I'm more likely to see them. So I'm going to do my best to be monitoring the chat and see if there's any questions. But if I miss anything, feel free to shout out again. If you see anything happening in the drawing that you're curious about or have any suggestions for improvement, let me know. So welcome, everybody. We get people from all over the place. Hi, Jen. I see that you're viewing here. So, oh, hey, Katie, welcome. It's been a while, so yeah, you spilled oil paint on your carpet. Yikes, that's right. Yeah, so welcome back. We do have people, we've been doing this for a long time now. We're at 125 episodes, 26, somewhere around there. And some of you have been with me since the very beginning, so I want to shout out that. Oh, before I forget, check out my book. It's available for pre-order on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. I put a link in the chat. At the, I kind of pinned that to the top. So if you like what you see here, the book is really built on what we do here. What I'd like to do is talk through my process, share my ideas for the techniques, but the whole goal is for you to develop your own process. So it's all about the decisions we make as artists and how we navigate through the process of studying the subject and asking particular questions to ourselves that kind of move us through. So the better we understand the subject, the stronger our drawing. The more we draw, the better we understand the subject, and they work together in a really beautiful way. So that's what this is all about. Let's get to it. Materials, I have this sheet of cotton rag paper provided by Legion Paper. I love working with cotton rag. I have, again, graphite. Now I'm going to use this graphite block. This is from General's Pencil. It came as part of this set here. Let me see what I got. It's this set here, which is a pretty awesome one. It has everything you really need to get going. And I really like the blocks of graphite. So I've got this graphite block, and then I have these two graphite pencils, this Kimberly, the 6B, which is relatively soft, and it's very soft actually, and then this layout, which is even softer. So I have a bias towards the soft graphites, but if you like the harder ones, I think you can achieve it very well. One of the reasons I like the soft graphites is because it just shows up a little bit better on camera, and you can kind of move it around more easily. Blending stump and paper towel to kind of wipe things down. Today is all going to be about the light that we see in the scene here. And so the ability to kind of build up broad areas of tone will become really handy in controlling those subtle value relationships. And then finally, erasers. I've got my Kneaded eraser. I've got this Factus rubber eraser, which is really awesome. And then my Derwent retractable eraser that I have carved down to this chisel tip to give me some precision and control. So there's a lot going on in this scene. And we talk about that a lot in this show, that there's, how do we manage all the information? So the process that I go through that I'll demonstrate here is really designed to allow me to manage the details, the refinement, to whatever degree I I choose. And so if you want to keep it loose and expressive, you can. If you really want to get in there and all the fine details, you can continue on and continue to add that. So we haven't used this block before, so I'm really excited to demonstrate it. When I created this preparatory drawing, I was surprised at how much I used it. So when we talk about all those details, it's possible to spend weeks really getting in and getting all those fine details in there. Or with the right touch and the right material, you can suggest all of that very easily. And so, or not very easily, but very simply, if I should say. So that's what I'm hopefully going to show here. Now, one of the challenges is getting the exposure right on the camera because it's so bright. It kind of messes with the camera. So I think my goal right now is to get a gesture established. So what I'm doing is kind of reacting to the scene, move my eyes quickly back and forth between the reference image and the paper. And if I leave my eyes kind of soft and kind of out of focus, it allows me to really conceive of these forms as simple abstract shapes. If I start thinking about tree, light, snow, etc., if I start identifying what these things are, then I have a greater tendency to get sucked into those details, and I start drawing from my preconceived notions about what these are and how to draw them. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the technique when using a block here. So you can see I'm really utilizing the side of the block. You know, this overhand grip. I have all this support here on the side, and if I just roll my hand slightly, if I could go like this, it kind of shortens the length of the stick. You can see how it's kind of curving a little bit. It's creating a camber on the stick that allows me to work with it on its full width or kind of a shorter section here. So where I can kind of modulate the size, the scale of the marks by simply rotating the wrist slightly. Now I'm just thinking about these overall masses. And one of the things that becomes very clear in this scene is the way the sun is bursting through the trees there. So right off the bat, I know that the whitest white is going to be right here. That means all of this light area here, all the light on the snow here is actually going to be darker than that. So I don't have to worry about preserving the white of the page. And I know there is certainly a time in my artistic practice, my career, where I would be highly concerned with trying to preserve that white of the page, and it would almost create a sense of anxiety when I would kind of mess up the white of the page. And so I've worked to overcome that and started to embrace the idea of the mess of the whole process. And so now you can see right here, just by building up these masses of value, we're starting to create the impression of light. Very quickly we can achieve a general understanding of the scene, and then we're going to continue to refine it. If you are following along and you have an entirely different process, I'd love to hear it. You know, share your own approach. And again, this is just a simple reaction to the scene. Moving very quickly, again, back and forth between looking at the reference image, so I'm looking at the one right in front of me, that small thumbnail that you see on the screen, and then my paper, and then over to the camera's projection on the right here. And as I work in this area, I know, again, this is where the light burst will be coming from. And it's overstated at this point, but as I kind of work around that area, I'm just careful to keep my pressure light as I move into that area. So putting a little bit more weight on the back end of the stick where I can get heavier here. Trying to vary my marks as well. You see some dark marks forming where there's like a crease in the paper, things like that. But the tooth of the paper is already showing some potential to create some kind of the illusion of texture there. This is all a very light touch. You know, I prefer to move very quickly with a light touch and build up multiple layers rather than try to kind of strike the proper value right away. Again, my eyes are all out of focus at this point, just taking in the overall shapes, the abstraction of the whole thing, looking at that balance between light and dark, looking at now at kind of the rhythm of the trees as we move across, you know, looking at the spacing, the way these shapes change and vary. One of the things that I tend to do, and I don't know if it's something that you all can associate with, but when I see this progression of trees, there's part of my brain that wants to create a regular pattern out of that, and I'll create these stripes that are evenly spaced and even consistent shapes. And instead, what I'm trying to do is override that a bit and try to identify the variety in that, the irregular rhythm, the irregular rhythmic pattern that is forming there. Okay. Hello, hello, everybody. See a lot of familiar names. Everybody joining in. Yeah, this does make me want to head up to the mountains here. All right, that was my first pass. I'm going to wipe this down, just being careful to preserve that that center where the light is going to be. And this is just a very light touch because I don't want to lose that tooth of the paper too much, but subsequent layers will be able to display that. And now what this is doing is building up that haze. So right away I'm starting to create that contrast and value between that light spot here. I lift this out a bit more. You can really see that contrast. And that's really important right there, because what happens if you focus on this area here, you'll see the contrast between light and dark. I'm talking about focusing on the reference image. If you look at that area, there's a tendency to see this as white. We kind of have that natural bias in our minds to kind of attribute, you know, light areas, make them feel lighter than they actually are, and dark areas feel like they're darker than they actually are. And so this is where it's really helpful to develop that the practice of the indirect gaze. So when I'm looking at this section of the reference image, I'm thinking about how bright this area is. And when I'm looking at this area, I'm thinking about the value here and how much darker that actually is. And using that to form my understanding of the value relationships rather than focusing directly on one area. And that's something that really comes into play a lot when painting as well. And so it's just something to consider as you're working along. Again, if anybody has any questions, if you're stuck, you know, let me know where you're stuck, so then we can see if anybody else has some suggestions for improvement. I think what I want to do right now is I want to now shift my thinking to calculating a little bit. Now, I don't know how important it's going to be to me yet to really really kind of nail the correct proportions on this. I think to some degree I want this drawing to be about the place, and as such, like we do with a portrait, for example, the proportions become important. You know, and I think there are a lot of artists out there that have different opinions about the ways in which we use the reference image. You know, so. But I think it can be helpful at the onset to have an idea for yourself how closely you want your drawing to match the reference and how much you're using the reference simply as a jumping off point and allowing the drawing to form its own composition. You know, the answer is going to be somewhere in the middle there. And I've, throughout my career, kind of fluctuated quite a bit where I will feel, you know, at some points where I just have to make everything, you know, really match the subject that I'm looking at, and then other times where there's a lot more deviation where I'm adjusting the composition to really, or adjusting the subject to really suit the composition, you know, trying to find a greater sense of balance or movement or visual interest. So What I'm doing here, though, is I really like this as the primary focal point because of the way the light is peeking through that tree. And so what I'm doing is just giving myself a little bit more information to get this placed where I want it. It's a little bit farther off to the right than what I'm seeing in the reference. So I think it feels to me a little bit too far. So I'm gonna bring this over, and I know I can kind of make this glowing light a little bit smaller. I can kind of shift the whole thing over. And then there's this group of trees over here. And then there's this one evergreen over here that kind of peeks out towards the end. And I just gave those specific labels, but I'm actually thinking more about just abstract shapes. But I feel like that's a stronger placement. I just moved the tree trunk over, maybe somewhere right in the middle there. And then we'll continue to adjust that. So we're going to actually be able to achieve quite a bit with this block. And again, I think the goal is to try to suggest more than anything, because I don't know about you, but I get really overwhelmed, and I think I've seen some comments there that suggest that this is a thoroughly overwhelming subject. So my instinct when I'm encountered with a scene that has this much information is to try to get as much as I can out of as few marks, to kind of go the opposite direction, away from the sheer detail, and become more expressive with the marks, see what the materials themselves can indicate, what they can describe, by simply reacting to the forms. And hopefully that makes sense. It's really kind of an abstract concept, and in a lot of it, it's a little bit easier to see it than describe it. But if you're not sure what I'm talking about, please let me know. So, oh, hello, Grace from Nigeria. Welcome. I don't know if you've viewed this before, but I believe you might be the first from Nigeria that we've seen. We see Henry from Mexico. Welcome. We got people from all over the U.S., Canada. This is awesome. Yeah, so many of you viewing from all over the place. If you are new and you're wondering what you're looking at, this is Drawing Together with Artists Network, where we meet every Wednesday, 3 p.m. Eastern, to draw together, because drawing is a great way to advance our skills in any art form. Okay. So this now looks like a bit of a hot mess, but in my mind, I know where that's going now. I'm going to kind of wipe this down, smooth it out a little bit. And I don't know, it's hard to know. I mean, everybody learns to draw, in different ways, right? We've all have our own paths on how we got here as artists. I know for me, I think my initial approach to drawing would have been to create an outline, essentially, of the subject and then kind of fill it in. And over the years, I've moved farther and farther away from that idea. And this is more of a kind of a painterly approach. The idea is that, I'm using the drawing process to ultimately make me a better painter. This is connecting me with the decisions I need to make when I'm painting, when I'm looking at a subject and I'm trying to translate that into paint on a two-dimensional surface. When you're painting, you're layering on the additional challenge of mixing colors accurately. But there are a lot of elements that are fundamental to drawing that also apply to painting. So I found that by taking more time to draw when I'm out in the field painting, I can make my decisions more rapidly. I can achieve greater accuracy with the proportions. I understand the composition a little bit better. I understand the process a little bit better about starting with these masses and then gradually refining until we found that nice balance and something that really creates a strong kind of expression of what we're studying. Let's see, Scott, would you mind going a bit more detailed about shading? Yes, I will certainly do that. Right now, ultimately shading is about controlling value relationships. And the stage I'm at right now is finding these main forms and finding just a general relationship between light and dark. So I'm not trying to match the values that I'm seeing in this subject at this point. And I'm not studying light and shadow with regards to the form, where the light side of the tree is, where the shadow side is, etc. I'm looking for generally an overall, an average value that I can use to represent the relationship between just basic dark and light. And then from there, we'll refine that even farther. So if I were doing this in a painting, I might start with an overall tone that refers to the subject, and a tone and a selection of hues to just find that basic mass of light and dark. And then from there, I'll divide the lights and then I'll divide the darks. So right now I'm taking a little bit more of a slow approach to refining these shapes. Again, my eyes are still blurred, but now as I have some of these trees indicated, and I'm relatively happy with it. There's a little bit more space here than what I'm seeing in the reference, but that's okay. I kind of like that rhythm. I think I'm going to keep that. But I'm looking at the relationship of this tree to this gap here. I can look at that negative space here, compare that to this overall positive space, look at that angle there, and just kind of looking across the drawing, comparing one thing to the next. And now this becomes a strong focal point, and I love the way this shadow kind of cuts across the surface, really reinforces that focal point, and it activates this corner of the composition. I like the way it kind of engages the bottom edge effectively, creating a really nice balance between these kind of triangular forms. And then we see this shadow here that has largely a vertical thrust to it that again leads us to the focal point. Oh, strapped to the camera. These shadows seem to kind of radiate out from that focal point. And so, yeah, when we get into that farther, I'll be sure to talk more about the shading and how do we really capture that contrast between the light snow that's in shadow and then those darker areas of the tree. And then when we look in here, there's this tree that seems to be backlit by the light source there. And then, of course, we have the cast shadows. So we've talked about that before. We've talked about the three shadow terms that are really helpful. There's the form shadow. There's the part of the form itself that's in shadow. It's called the form shadow. There's the cast shadow, and then there's called the shadow shape. So if we look here, this is a very clear definition of a cast shadow. There's a tree here that's casting a shadow. The tree itself is in shadow. We're looking at the shaded side. That's the form shadow. And when you combine the two together, you get what's called the shadow shape. And right now, my primary objective is to look for that shadow shape and unify those two. right, but that's a really good question. If anybody else has suggestions, things that you'd like to talk about, or if you have anything to contribute to the conversation about shading, feel free to throw that out there. And now I'm just looking at this line here of the trees where we have that snow field, and then we have the line that the trees make over here. So I want to get that kind of established. So again, very broad decisions that I'm making right now, and then we'll move into making more specific, kind of detailed decisions. And now you can see, in general, what I'm trying to do is when I'm creating the forms, rather than outline them, I'm, if I look at the tree, for example, it's this tall kind of triangular form. I'm trying to visualize that form and then create it using marks that run in a contrasting direction. And in that way, it's creating marks that feel more naturally formed. It's the same with the shadows here. If I visualize this path, create it by using marks that seem to stop along that path. Okay. I'm going to smooth this area a little bit. Now, one of the things that's happening is when I look at the drawing here, with my own eyes, this looks nice and smooth, nice and even. When I look at the screen that's being captured by the camera above me, it's picking up more kind of variations in that value. And I'm going to work to smooth that out a little bit so I can create some contrast and texture. But I'm not going to fuss with that now. That's one of the other things that I've kind of learned over the years is, I would look at something and it would capture my attention and say, oh, I need to fix that. And so I kind of fuss with it. And I work on another area, mess up the area that I was just working on, and then I got to correct it again. And I just find myself chasing this, these certain areas, trying to correct them, and then just continue to mess them up. So I've learned over the years to let some areas just sit until I've worked the rest of the drawing, and then come back to it at the end. And if I find myself with a desire to kind of fuss in a particular area, it's kind of a red flag that goes into my mind that says, all right, stop, just leave it. So what I'm doing here is I'm kind of smoothing out these areas, picking up some graphite, and with the paper towel just bringing it over to this area, creating a bit of a gradient, darkening that sky a little bit more, and that's going to enhance that value contrast there. And I can be a little, I don't know, less controlled in this area, as I kind of make marks like that, very subtle, it starts to suggest some of the clouds that are in that sky as well. And if I'm aware compositionally of that this is the focal point, I can construct some of these very subtle marks in a way that lead me to this area here. So I'm just going to lift this off here just to continue to protect that highlight. But you can really see how strong that's looking right now, that light there. So I've kind of overstated it compared to the reference, but I'm going to leave it. I kind of like it. And I may try to adjust it even farther. Now, one of the things about value is that we're always calibrating our understanding of values to the range that we're seeing there. So what I mean by that is that we look at the lightest light and we tend to attribute that as being white. We look at the darkest dark and we tend to start to see that as black. And then when you go into that even more, it reframes our understanding of the value. So what I mean by that is that right now this is reading as black, as dark. But when you compare that to, say, this black pencil, this is quite a bit darker than this right in here. So it's sometimes helpful to kind of keep in mind that our understanding of the values will continually shift. Jerry Davis, how long would you spend on a full drawing? Well, today I'll finish this drawing today, and it's typically about 2 hours. That's what for the show I try to do that. But otherwise, there is no real time frame that I look at on a drawing. Sometimes, you complete a drawing in 20 minutes, and sometimes it takes 20 hours. And it all depends on what I'm going for. Because if you're new, one of the things that we talk about a lot on this show is identifying with the word drawing, right? Drawing is a verb and a noun. This is a drawing, but we're getting this there by drawing. And so from my perspective, it's more about the experience. This is going to be a record of an experience that we're having drawing. And that experience encapsulates so much. It's all about us connecting with the subject, connecting with the materials, and processing and solving the puzzle of the subject through the drawing process. So in that way, the drawing can express a certain amount of struggle. And that's something that I value quite a bit. And in that, sometimes it's a very quick response. Sometimes I want to be more expressive and direct. That's the experience of drawing that I want to have. And that in and of itself will be a complete drawing. And sometimes I want to have the experience of really slowing down my thought and engaging with these finer elements and solving all the very small decisions and observations in the subject. And maybe that takes many, many hours. And sometimes it's a matter of working on a drawing, setting it aside, coming back to it later, and continuing to put more time into it. But I typically don't. I don't really identify time as something that kind of reflects the quality of the drawing. So hopefully that makes sense. But all right, now what I want to do is I'm going to do some subtractive drawing to refine these shapes, and then I'm going to go back in and apply some additional refinement. And so with my rubber eraser, if I bear down on this, I can really get back to the white of the page. If I go just very lightly, you can see how I can lift without creating a mark that's as light as this. So that's what I'm going to be doing here. So I'm switching my thinking now to the negative space. And so what I mean by that is that if you're new to that term, the positive space is the subject that you're targeting. So the tree may be the positive space. The negative space is the shape of the sky that's formed around that tree. And if I put my attention on that shape of this blue sky, it can help me to control the proportions in an interesting way. So now what I'm doing is that I'm trying not to engage with the details too much, but I'm trying to make more of a specific shape from these trees here. And again, it's just a very light touch so that I'm not lifting off too much material. Jerry, it's the journey, not the destination. Yes, well said. I mean, but this is what I love about drawing, is that we each have our own association with it. So for some of you, it will be the destination, and there's nothing wrong with it. But for me, it's I tend to prioritize the journey. If it's an effective process, then my hope is that then the drawing will express that. This is a record of an experience. All right, so I'm just kind of dragging up to the edge, kind of slightly, to refine those edges. Now I'm looking for what are called the sky holes. And those are the areas that we see through the trees, through the branches of the trees. And I'm just kind of dragging along with the broad side of the eraser here to start to suggest those sky holes. Again, looking more at the negative space than the positive space. And there's going to be some areas where I'm going to come back in and draw the trees back on top of it. So we'll be working back and forth. And I know there was a time when I was working on landscapes and really, when I became aware of the sky holes, my tendency was to overstate them. And what would happen is it would create these bright spots that would kind of come up to the surface. They would just pop off the subject. And so then I've been really working on properly describing those sky holes and making them a little bit darker than they feel. So what happens, especially in like an area like this, those little areas of light feel lighter than they actually are because of they're in the context of darker areas around it. And so I'm intentionally kind of understating them compared to how I feel they should be. We're really good at perceiving subtle variations in value, so don't be afraid of subtlety in your work. I know for me there was definitely a time in my practice when I felt the need to kind of go overboard by clarifying things, and there was just too much contrast, and then I started to embrace the subtlety of things, and I think perhaps a little bit too subtle, and now I'm trying to find that balance there. So I'm looking also at what's kind of happening on the drawing. It's a kind of an important aspect of painting is to kind of allow the brush to describe some things, and you can kind of see what it's suggesting that you can then leverage to turn into branches of a tree, even if they don't really kind of match what you're seeing exactly. So if I look at this shape, for example, it's somewhat like what I'm seeing in that branch there, but not really. There's a lot of variation, but I kind of like the marks that are there, and I think I'm going to leave those. And if I get to the point where it's really bothering me that it's not really matching the reference, then I can adjust it. So again, just kind of looking at the negative space and starting to add a little bit of clarity to the edges of these forms. And it's really easy to get lost. I'm moving back and forth relatively quickly between the drawing and the reference photo. And it's really easy to get lost, looking, when you come back up to the reference image, say, well, where am I at? And I'll start, I'm working on one tree here, and then I'll look up at the reference photo, observing a different tree, but drawing it in the same spot as it was before. So kind of keep that in mind. Do a quick check-in to make sure before you kind of strike a mark on the page that you are indeed observing the area that you're intending to. And I know that sounds kind of weird, but at least that's something for myself that I've had to battle. So. And you can see that it's really, I'm doing a lot of kind of tapping in these short marks out rather than really strong and bold kind of marks. Just kind of tapping and lifting and then moving along. My eyes are still blurred when I'm doing this whole thing, so it helps me to see the overall shapes. Now I'm observing that this negative space is different, right? I'm a little bit, I've made this shape too large, but I'm going to keep it because I like what that's doing rhythmically to the composition. It's kind of shifted this tree over just a bit. Okay, how's everybody doing? Anybody drawing along? if you're just joining us, what you're watching is Drawing Together with the Artist Network. My name's Scott Maier. You can find the reference image in the description below. You can also find the link to the page on Artist Network where you can share your work. And if you like what you see, be sure to like the video, subscribe, do all that fun stuff, set up notifications, because we meet every Wednesday. Now, next Wednesday, I won't be able to join you live, but I've pre-recorded a drawing that will, that video will be available at the same time, so 3 p.m. Eastern next Wednesday. So that means those of you who join can chat with one another as you normally do when we're working live. Okay. So what I'm doing right now is I'm modulating my gaze a bit. So I'm kind of coming in and out of focus, right? Mostly it's out of focus. Everything's kind of blurry right now for me. And then I'll come into sharp focus for just a little bit and then back out. And when you're in focus, it's a great way to see kind of the refined shapes a little bit easier. And then by softening your gaze, you see the context a little bit more easily. So I think it's really important to practice that. So squinting, flooding your eyes, letting them relax focus, bringing them into sharp focus. And every time you do, you're going to gather a little bit more information about the value relationships, about the shapes, about the overall composition that you can utilize to bring your drawing together. I'm drawing along and I'm using, so lucky sevens, I'm drawing along and I'm using this piece to enter into my school art competition. Awesome. I hope that goes well for you. And so one of the other things that we'll talk about is what kind of happens in the mind when we're drawing kind of white snow, right? We know this is white, but we can't, if we draw literally, then this would all just essentially be a white sheet of paper. What we're doing is we're drawing optically. And so what that means is that we understand that this is white snow, but optically you can see the contrast in values. You have white snow here, but it's really quite dark compared to the light here. And so sometimes we have to confront that part of our brain that is trying to make sense of the scene in front of us. There's 3 main truths that I kind of describe. As there's the literal truth, that this is a snow-covered tree scene, that snow is white, that the sky is blue, etc. There's the optical truth. There's really what we're actually seeing. There's the shapes, the values, the textures, etc. And then there's a symbolic truth, though. So there's what we project onto it based on our previous drawings and our previous understandings. And so our brain is kind of processing all of those things, and some of us prioritize symbolic truth over literal truth, or literal truth over optical truth, etc. And with this optical drawing process here, what we're doing is we're prioritizing the optics. We're looking at the optical truth of this. What are the value relationships, the shapes that we're seeing, etc. And then by reconstructing that experience on the page, it's going to trigger something in the viewer. So the viewer may look at this, accept the optical truth, but understand it literally or understand it symbolically. So hopefully that makes sense. So as I'm going through this, I'm refining the shapes of the light on the snow as well. So kind of refining this shadow shape of the tree into that snow field. And really trying to study this shape here. And if you need to, you can use angle sighting. So if you close one eye, align your pencil on top of the reference image with the angle that you're targeting. And in that, I'm just looking at, trying to describe the shape of the shadow with greater precision. And then I'm also trying to identify the areas where there's greater sharpness to the edges. So right in here, for example, in this shadow, this edge in here is a bit sharper. It's closer to the light source, where these edges get sharper. As we move down away from that light source, they become a little bit more diffused. So much of drawing, when you're trying to draw with a certain degree of realism, is simply expanding our awareness of things. There's so much to be aware of in a scene, of really any subject, but in particular a complex scene. And we can, as we draw, you start to become more aware of things that you may not have been aware of before. The idea of value relationships, for example, or shapes or perspective. Because a lot of that information is not really necessary. So our brains don't really, kind of point out things that that we need when we're drawing. Because so for example, in a split second we understand this as a snow scene. With the trees, the light, the shadows, etc. Our brain is solving a lot of problems for us. It's taking in all the shapes, the value relationships, the textures, etc. And in that very split second, it's sending to our conscious mind what we think is important. And so for some of us, what might be important is understanding the temperature. How deep is the snow? Is that something that we could cross, easily or not? Is it really just about, is it just a scene that is really beautiful to us, that is creating a sense of calm? Is there an emotional response that we're aware of? But when drawing optically, we're taking time to really digest all that raw data that our brain is processing in that split second. So it's trying to shed a lot of things regarding our emotional response, the definitions of these objects, these preconceived notions about how to draw something, and about how something looks. It's all about analyzing what's behind our kind of consciousness. And our consciousness is, our brain is designed to send to our consciousness what is useful, right? And what it might be useful in the scene for you, it might be different than what's useful for me. And the more time you draw, the more time you paint, the more you're telling your brain that these issues are useful. Understanding shapes, values, composition, textures, lines, edges, all of those things are now useful when perhaps they weren't as useful before. All right. Bonnie's saying your explanation about ways to look at the subjects and using our right brain to interpret the subject. Awesome. Gail is saying, using what I have on hand, still working on the shading, not dark enough though. I have a habit of not going dark and needing to go back again. Next time at our store, I'll pick up a graphite stick. That's awesome. That's a really good observation, and I know exactly how you feel, because it's taken me a long time to kind of overcome that. And I typically have a bias towards kind of those lighter observations, and that's why I am shifting to these softer pencils so much, because it forces me to go darker. And I do that in my painting as well. And it can get really frustrating sometimes, because I'll end up having to go back over an area over and over again just to make it darker. But yeah, like you said, it's having the right materials helps. So I've kind of forced myself to use these darker, softer materials to help overcome that bias towards these light values. Part of what's happening in that is that, again, it has to do with the calibration of our understanding of values. When we're starting with a white piece of paper, any mark you make on that paper is going to feel darker than it actually is. And as such, we get comfortable with that value. We assume it's correct earlier than we need to, until you get something that's even darker to contrast that, and then it puts the values in proper context. So hopefully that makes sense. But it is part of the process just to go over and over again and just keep correcting. So, okay. I think what I want to do is expand this down. Just adjust this shape a little bit more. Okay. Now I'm really liking the soft atmospheric light that we have here. And so I don't want to override that. So I'm going to try to play around with the focus a little bit. Maybe let some of these trees stay really soft. I'm going to just do a quick check-in to see if there's any other sky holes that I can indicate. Now I do have a larger reference image up here on my left, but I'm not going to use that. I'm going to stay using the smaller thumbnail on the screen in front of me. But what I'm doing right now is, before I start to refine it, I'm just looking at these shapes to make sure that they're interesting and they're descriptive. So are they describing the shapes of the trees in an effective way? And are the shapes interesting? And when I say interesting, ultimately what I'm looking at is rhythm. You know, is there an irregularity to it, or does it feel like I'm doing just kind of this repetitive pattern? You know, it's hard because, especially, you know, this time of year, as we move into the holidays, you know, it brings to mind all of those drawings I did when I was younger of these symbolic kind of Christmas trees. You know, these jagged zigzag, these symmetrical forms that's very quickly identify as trees. And so there's that muscle memory that's starting to play into it, and I kind of just want to go zig, zig, zigzag and draw the tree, but that's not really what I'm seeing. So I'm trying to really lock into the description of the trees I'm seeing in front of me. Okay. Put that down. Okay. And I'm going to grab my 6B, and with a light touch, I'm just going to start to refine that edge on all of these trees. So I'm kind of starting in the center of the form, looking for a flat value. And it's feeling uncomfortably dark at this point, but I'm going to sit with it because I know I can go darker on top of it. And then when I do that, it's going to make this area that feels too dark now, I think it's going to actually bring it into a bit greater clarity. It's going to be more correct. All right, so I'm just moving through, and I'm using this overhand grip, looking kind of at the direction of the marks, the way these branches are flowing. And I'm trying to keep them fairly gestural. And you can see that the mark I'm making is this kind of scooping, tapping and dragging across the paper. And as I'm observing, like here, for example, the boughs of the tree kind of have this scooping motion. And I'm simply kind of reacting to that. And it's just these quick kind of taps on the paper. And it's starting to read with greater precision. So now that I have these larger forms established, I can be focusing more exclusively on the specific form of this tree. And if I kind of stay in this area, I know it's going to hold up. It's going to be placed properly on the page. But I'm intentionally using the side of the pencil here rather than the tip. And the reason is because I find that it creates marks that feel more naturally formed. As soon as I switch to this tripod grip and I start drawing lines, there's something that happens in the viewer's mind that says those are different shapes, those different objects, and it promotes division rather than unity on the page. So I'm kind of modulating the gaze a little bit coming in and out of focus. Again, just looking for an average value, an average shape that's now a bit more refined, and I'm going to go back into it and add the darker darks. But you can achieve so much by simply just kind of tapping on the page and just suggesting rather than really trying to describe. And so when I'm looking at these shapes, there's really two main things that I'm looking for. What is that shape, and what direction? What's the movement? And then that's informing the direction I go with the pencil. So as I look at these branches down here, for example, they have a downward thrust to them, and it's different here than it is over here. It's a different shape, different movement entirely. As I come up here, this is a different tree and has a different shape and a different kind of directional quality to it. And these really have these swoops to them. So in that way, there's this trust in the abstraction that if you get the abstraction right, it will read kind of realistically, if that makes sense. Because this is all an abstraction that we're creating here. And a very light touch on the pencil. I'm just using this overhand grip again to really utilize the side of the pencil. And what that's doing is it's preserving the tip. It's actually sharpening the pencil as I go. So then I can use that tip for just a few areas where I need to have sharper edges and greater control. But that's just going to be in a few key areas. So again, if you're getting overwhelmed, just kind of trust your marks if you can, and trust the gestural quality of it. How do these shapes feel to you? Try not to think about tree, snow, etc., branches. Just think about shape and direction. I just broke the tip of the pencil, but that's all right. I'm going to sharpen up the trunk of the tree just a bit. Really softening as I go into that burst of light. I just felt myself kind of getting interested in getting all of those details. Bonnie is asking, how did you get such a long, sharp point to your pencil? I use a razor blade to sharpen. So if I pull this up here, so it's just simply this. I just kind of push with a razor blade and gradually sharpen that way. It takes a little time, takes a little practice. It takes a very sharp blade. And if you find that it's breaking your pencil tip, it's generally you need a sharper blade. You can go through blades pretty quickly in sharpening both charcoal and graphite. All right, Lucky Sevens, thank you. Sorry you have to go. Okay, so I'm gonna continue to refine these edges here. And so I kind of become aware of the kind of these kind of sharper edges here. I'm just turning my pencil vertically to help with that, and then it's just this kind of downward light kind of touch to capture the branches. So again, it just direction and shape, trying to understand the kind of the rhythm of the tree. And I'm letting my marks be driven by the observations rather than getting sucked into the mark making. It's so easy to get focused on what's happening on the page and just start making marks and kind of lose sight of what is happening in the reference. And so I'm trying to stay focused on really studying the tree. And even if it's not lining up perfectly with the reference photo, it's informed by what we're observing. And the viewer can pick that up. You know, we can tell when marks are made from direct observation and we're really studying something. And so this is, again, I'm trying to let the materials do more of the talking, I guess, in a way. Letting the tooth of the paper also kind of shine through. So with using the side of the pencil, it creates these marks that kind of skip across the surface of the paper, and it utilizes that tooth, which suggests greater detail than is we're actually taking the time to render. I'm moving over to this tree here. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just kind of observe what's happening on the page. At some point I'll start reacting to really just what's happening on the page and stop looking at the reference, but it's not quite time to do that. I'm bringing my eyes in and out of focus here. One of the things that can be really helpful is to just focus on varying the marks. And especially with landscapes like this, it's very uncommon to see kind of regular marks, kind of especially rectangulars, straight lines, things like that. That's typically indicative of something that's man-made and not naturally formed. So in a scene like this, there's no man-made elements in it. So embrace the irregularity. Now I've given a little bit more clarity to that line there in the tree. I think what I want to do now is there's this tree here. There's this tree here. I think I need to sharpen this edge up. So I'm going to bring out my my rubber eraser again, and I'm going to try to indicate some of the light that's capturing, that's kind of catching in the halo around this tree. And again, don't go overboard with it, but you know, but you don't want a strong line around the whole thing. But try to, again, observe the shape and direction of these light areas. And in that way, now we're starting to describe this tree as being backlit. This is largely a kind of washed out area. There we go. Now I'm going to move through the rest of the drawing and see where else I can indicate some of the light. So for example, like right on the trunk of this tree, I can lightly indicate kind of light striking there. I'm going to try to capture some of the light striking on this tree. So it's just kind of tapping in these areas. And it's all very subtle. Again, it's not making a huge impact, but I think we'll be able to pick up on that as viewers. Thinking about the light source being here, where it might strike the trees, and kind of reacting to where it feels like the light is striking. Like right in here, for example, this stretch of the trees is kind of in light a little bit more. So just picking up a little bit with the edges, but I want to be careful not to overstate it. Okay. What am I doing now? Okay, I'm going to adjust this shape. That feels wrong. Okay. Now, how are we doing? We're about an hour into the drawing. We're actually flying along now. How's everybody doing? I'm just studying my drawing here, trying to take stock of what's happening in the whole thing. Now what I want to do is I'm going to come back in with this darker pencil, and I'm going to start in this area and just kind of refine this tree here. Again, engaging the side of the pencil more than the tip. And I can just roll my wrist a little bit when I need to get a little bit more precision. Actually, I need to lower this down, raise that up. I'm going to bring this up here. What's happening is I'm looking at these two trees and they're in line with one another. And that messes with the spatial relationships between them. So I'm going to bring this tree back a little bit, and that pulls that forward. So we talked about that earlier. I found that average value. It felt too dark. Now I'm coming back in with some of the darker areas, and that's going to recontextualize those values. I'm going to see those values differently now. And this is what's kind of part of the magic of drawing is this, because we don't have the ability to perceive values in isolation. We can only see them as value relationships. We're always evaluating a value by its relationship to the values surrounding it. So now as I work through this area, I'm just looking for those areas of dark. And I think it's going to help me to keep my eyes softly focused, to not get sucked into kind of describing too much, because then it gets overwhelming. So there's just so much happening. I use this kind of modified grip. So it's not a tripod grip like this. I'm kind of wedging it between my fingers, but stabilizing it like I would with a tripod grip. And now I'm thinking about both positive and negative space. So as I look at these dark shapes here, that negative space, those lighter areas, start to suggest the shape of the snow catching on those boughs. But again, I'm going to keep my eyes mostly out of focus and then just bring them into focus occasionally. Making just a few quick notes, pausing, evaluating, making an observation, taking a few quick notes. I'm going to try to soften some of these edges that are a little bit too harsh. And as I look down here, I'm just going to try to observe this line along the snow where these branches kind of make contact. All right, thank you, Deanne. Jackie, thank you. I'm glad you're happy with yours. That's the hope. Although I am very impressed with many of you who share your work on Artist Network and you say, oh, I'm happy with this part, or I'm not happy with this, but you're willing to share it anyways. That's how we grow and learn, is by kind of sharing our mistakes, and not mistakes, but learning opportunities, right? Let's see. I need to kind of reevaluate some of these as kind of embrace the abstraction, continue to think gesturally. I don't want to get too rigid and lose the kind of the energy in this drawing. I need to stay loose and gestural. And kind of make simple yet declarative statements when I'm making the marks. All right, I'm going to darken this a little bit here. Really try to bring that forward. And then I think just in a few areas here I can deepen some of the shadows. Yeah, using the tooth of the paper there, just scraping the darker layer on top of that creates all of these little dark flecks that kind of read as detail when I haven't really done anything. So that's where, what I talk about when I'm kind of letting the materials do what they do rather than really try to fight and get in there and describe, because I don't really have the patience. That's just how I am. I kind of wish I had that patience sometimes, and so, if you're so inclined to want to describe every detail, and that's the experience you want, then go for it. So, all right. Okay. So I think that's working out pretty well. I'm going to switch to my blending stump, and I'm going to kind of smooth things out a little bit more in the snow. So using these circular marks so that they're more kind of omnidirectional, and letting the blending stump roll in my fingers so it's not so that it's not kind of creating an unevenness. I want the graphite to be evenly distributed across the surface there. And hopefully then that's creating some contrast in the texture, but letting some of the tooth show in the trees, but kind of really filling in some of the tooth in the snow areas. All right, I'm going to use the Kneaded eraser because it's a little bit more gentle. It'll lift, but it won't be so harsh that it'll compete with this. So I want this to be the brightest spot. All right, and then here I'm going to prioritize this side, the inside here, where the light is a little bit stronger, and just let this kind of be unfinished. Just kind of refine those shapes a little bit. And then you can see some kind of texture to the snow. Or there's some ridges that are catching it a little bit more. And then over here, I'm just going to break that up a little bit, because that white line is really was kind of popping off. So I'm softening that bottom edge a little bit to help anchor it to the ground. And bringing this down a little bit over here. So, but I think we're only an hour and a quarter in. This was a fast one. That went a lot faster than I thought it would. I can see that, looking at the reference photo, you see those distinct rays from the sun. And I don't think I want to include that. I don't think that's really the experience that I would see in the field. It's kind of an effect of the lens that we might get through the lens of our eye, but I kind of like that, the softer edge there. Kind of indicate there's a little bit of that tree, keep it light in there. So I'm just looking at some of these shapes feel a little bit hard right now, so I'm going to soften those up a little bit, feather them out. Kind of suggest more these dark areas in the tree by just scraping across the surface of the paper. Let that tooth show to some degree. So this has been a fun one to kind of actually be a little bit more expressive, right? And it felt intimidating to, because there's so many elements to this, so much detail that could go into it. But in the end, it ultimately just becomes about these gestural marks. I think I want to kind of tighten up a little bit in here, reinforce the focal point. So I'm just kind of refining some of these edges here, providing what appears to be a little bit more detail there. Hopefully, that reinforces the focal point. It brings us into that center a bit more effectively. So I hope everybody has enjoyed this. I want to thank you all for joining me. Whew, this was a fun one. I feel exhausted. I feel like that was a bit of a sprint today, getting this done. It did go by faster than I anticipated, but that's just how it goes. Again, next week I won't be able to join you live, but I will have a video that will be posted for you to watch at the same time, again, 3 p.m. Eastern. My name's Scott Maier. This is Drawing Together with Artists Network. Check out the link at the top of the chat. You can, if you're interested, if you like what you see here and you're curious about my book, check it out on Amazon. It's available for pre-order today. Be sure to like, subscribe, do all of those things so that you can see when the next live stream is happening. Otherwise, I will join you all next year. Have a great holiday. Happy New Year, everybody. Keep drawing throughout the whole time. It's a good time to kind of to take time for yourself and get some drawing done if you haven't had that. So if you are new and you're kind of curious, you can go back to any of the old episodes. You find the reference images and you can watch all the drawings, all the videos that we had, all the live streams. And so there's 120 some odd of them that you can explore. So again, thank you all for joining me. It has been a pleasure. I'm glad you enjoyed it. It doesn't look like there's any additional questions. All right. Have a great holiday.